How should you know where to place the speakers versus where to place your mix position?
One thing that we have to get right is the equilateral triangle. And you probably heard this before potentially, but the equilateral triangle, you want it to be equidistant between the tweeters of the speaker and also your head. However, one thing that people often do is just think it's this point right in the center of your head. You actually want that point of the equilateral triangle to be about a foot behind your head. And the reason for that is that if you aim it right at the point of your head, then all the sound is directed at your nose. And we don't hear with our nose, we hear with our ears. And so it's important to have that go past your ears about a foot behind your head, and then the sound is going to arrive at your head the way that you want it to. So here showing this graph, or this diagram of a equilateral triangle. This one happens to be 5 foot on each side of that equilateral triangle. That can adjust, and that's kind of part of the process and experimentation with placing speakers. But you can see it's 5 foot on each side. The speakers are towed in so that it creates a 60-degree angle on each side of that equilateral triangle, and that peak of the point of the triangle is actually about a foot behind the listener. Sure. But this equilateral triangle is super important to make sure that you're receiving energy from the left and right speaker at the same time, but also you're sitting right in that sweet spot to get the best sound possible. Then the other thing that we want to look at is where you sit in the room. And there's this rule of thumb that a lot of acousticians use where it's taking the length of the room and multiplying it by 0.38. So it's taking 38% of the length of the room. And this works, I'd say, 95% of the time. If it's a rectangular space, this is where you end up having the best response. And so you see this diagram here. I'm showing a top view of a room, and it shows the length there, and then the mix position is placed at 0.38 times that length. So for instance, if your room was 10 foot long, you'd be 3.8 feet away from the front wall is where your head would be. And then you kind of size your equilateral triangle and your speakers on top of that. If we look at our next graph, this is a frequency response graph of a room that didn't have any acoustical treatment, and I just arrived on site, and he actually had his mix position pushed right up against the front wall, really close to the front wall, and it ended up sitting at about the 25% point instead of this 38% point that we'd like to get to. So he's just closer to the front wall than we would have liked. Sure. But if we look at this 48 hertz peak that's happening, so right around here, there's a peak of energy at 48 hertz. It happened to relate to a front to back axial mode. And again, we'll cover modes again on a different podcast, but sound was traveling front to back and canceling up and building up at different spots because of an axial mode. Mm-hmm. And it happened at 48 hertz here, and that blue line on this graph was the response when I first arrived, and I just put the microphone at the listening position that the client had already selected. Every line that you see as this kind of, you see it goes down to a orange line, a purple line, or it's a red line, a purple line, an orange line, then a green line. All that is me moving the mix position back 6 inches each time. And notice that it takes sometimes 1 to 2 decibels off of that peak to bring it back down more in line with, if you look at the average in the low frequency range, it's maybe where this line I'm drawing is. Before it was about 6 dB above that line. Mm-hmm. And then just by moving things back, you were able to take control of that. Now, I will say with acoustical treatment, that's going to be very difficult to handle because it's 48 hertz. It's low in the frequency range. You're going to need really deep bass trapping or potentially even a tuned device in order to address that. And this was able to be remedied just by experimentation and testing.
So if we were to add a subwoofer to that and make it a 2.1 system, what kind of things do we need to kind of have on the radar when we're looking into doing that?
When it comes to placing your subwoofer, there's a trick that we use a lot that it seems not super scientific, but it works every time. And it's called the subwoofer crawl. You actually place the subwoofer at your mix position. And so you take that subwoofer, set it right where your chair would be, and you play some things through your system, through the speakers and the sub, that have some good low frequency content that you're familiar with. And it sounds silly, but you actually get down on your hands and knees and you crawl around your room and put your ears in locations where the subwoofer could potentially go. Sure. Okay, so it could be crawling around the backside of the desk or the sides there. You just move your ears throughout these different locations, and what you're going to hear is certain areas where the bass seems way overpowering and too boomy and bass heavy. Other times where it seems too thin and isn't as present. But then there's going to be spots where it's like, man, that seems really consistent and even. And the crazy thing is, you just put a little, like I usually put a piece of painter's tape on the ground in those locations that were good. You can then pick up that subwoofer, place it on those spots, and then you go sit in your mixed position instead, and it translates. Okay, and so what you experience there on the floor, it can then you can experience that in your listening position. You're really able to discern, like, okay, this spot sounded better than this spot. I'm going to try that, and it also saves your back from having to move the subwoofer so many times.
Sure.